You know, I guess one person can make a difference. Enough said.
Hello, and welcome to another broadcast of Comics Let's Talk. November 12th, 2018 is a very sad day for those of us who grew up reading comic books, especially those who read Marvel comic books. As a kid, I was a make mine Marvel. The only DC title I collected on a regular basis was Batman. Every other comic book I collected was Marvel, and I picked up a few of the independents, sometimes a Charlton comic. I loved E-Man, and that's going to be the subject of my next show. And I read some Gold Keys. They did a good take with their horror anthologies, and I loved Star Trek, even though their Star Trek comics were a little crazy, but I loved them. They were great. But basically, the comic books I collected were Marvel. And I think it's safe to say that nobody has done more for the world of comic books than Stan Lee. Not just Marvel comic books. He did some work with DC in his Just Imagine series, and his way of doing things, influenced the entire comic book world. So today, on Comics Let's Talk, going to celebrate the life of comic book legend Stan Lee. And I'm going to start reading portions of an article from writer Peter David. This is from the Vulture website. Everyone knows Stan Lee, and there's no reason they shouldn't. Stan has been omnipresent in the American social realm and consciousness since the rise of Marvel Comics sent comic books spiraling off into directions no one ever could have seen coming. Before the rise of Marvel, comic books were considered strictly kids' entertainment. Stan took that concept and turned it on its ear. Despite admonitions from publisher Martin Goodman that heroes never had problems, Stan gave us the Fantastic Four, a family of heroes who are as likely to squabble with one another as to challenge a villain. He gave us Peter Parker, who went from being a teenager with huge issues to a superhero with huge issues. Mythic heroes from Gilgamesh to Hercules had huge personal difficulties and outsized personalities that landed them in trouble more often than not. Stan followed that lead and gave us heroes who had sizable problems to overcome, ranging from personal trials to physical drawbacks. By contrast, the DC heroes had weaknesses, yes, but theirs were arbitrary and supernatural. Superman had problems with a green rock. Martian Manhunter crumbled before flame. Green Lantern, depending on which one we're discussing, was vulnerable to either yellow or wood, meaning you could take out either one with a number 2 pencil. Compare them to Tony Stark, whose heart was constantly menaced by pieces of shrapnel that were prevented only by the chest plate of his armor from piercing it. Stan actually took a hardened defense contractor billionaire and made him sympathetic. Even as Stan turned over the writing of the comics to others, his support and promotion of Marvel was unrelenting. He crisscrossed the country, making appearances at dozens of colleges. The fact that Marvel's comics were hugely popular in universities was surprising to everyone. Students would argue over whether the X-Men were based on racial inequality or served as an allegory for gay experience. And Stan would listen and shake his head. Still, there was a time when Stan became the incarnation of that line from The Dark Knight. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. In the 80s and 90s, it became increasingly stylish to bash Stan, to accuse him of hogging attention for his creations from the artists. But the fact is that before Marvel Comics, comics writers and artists were anonymous. It was Stan who made the artists the centerpieces of their work, giving them snappy nicknames like Stainless Steve Ditko, Genial Gene Colan, LaRupin Larry Lieber. No, even his brother wasn't immune. And many others. We would come to know the artists and other writers as well as, if not better than, members of our own families. DC editors were so disdainful of this practice that they referred to him as Stan Bragg, before eventually following suit and crediting people themselves. But the hostility towards Stan seemed to wane over the years. Maybe it was all his cameo appearances in the multi-billion-dollar Marvel movies. We saw how much fun he was having, just being Stan Lee, and it was hard to resist his charms. Over the years, I became faster and faster friends with Stan. We worked on projects such as Marvel 2099. I worked with him to write an anti-drug book for the FBI. It was terrible, don't look for it. I visited with him whenever I was in LA. Once we were driving to lunch, and he was asking me about what I was going to be doing on my new assignment, The Incredible Hulk. I told him I was bringing back the Hulk who took his superhero form from when the moon rose, like a werewolf. Stan looked surprised and said, "I thought he changed when he got angry." "Not in the beginning," I said. "It was the moonrise." He frowned and said, "I wonder why we changed it." Then he shrugged and said, it was probably Jack's idea. I once saw Stan and Jack in huddled private conversation in a hotel lobby at a convention called WonderCon. I wondered what in the world they were talking about. I never had the nerve to ask him. At least now, they can resume their chat. And now we come to Wikipedia. Stan Lee was born Stanley Martin Lieber, December 28th, 1922. He lived a full life, passing away on November 12th, 2018. Not only did he make it to 95 years of age, which most of us probably won't, he was also active up until the final months of his life, still doing cameos. In fact, he has a cameo in Avengers number 4. Still doing the movie cameos, still promoting comics, and just being an all-around great guy until pneumonia stopped him from making his final comic book convention appearances. He was an American comic book writer, editor, and publisher. He was the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics and later its publisher and chairman, leading its expansion to a publishing house to a large multimedia corporation. Stanley Martin Lieber was born on December 28, 1922 in Manhattan, New York City. Lee attended DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. And here I found a clip of Stan singing his high school theme song.
I am really excited. I haven't sung my Clinton marching song, or I could even call it my Clinton battle song, in a long time. And I'm going to do it now, and I'm going to send it to DeWitt Clinton so that all those students can enjoy it and realize that an alumnus, many decades later, still loves that song and is inspired by it. Here we go. Now, I'm no singer. I'll probably be flat and off key, but remember, it's the meaning that counts. It's the heart. And here we go. DeWitt, C-L-I-N-T-O-N, boom! Clinton, oh Clinton, ever to thee, fairest of high schools, give her 3 times 3, oh fellows, long may we cherish thee, faithful will be, Clinton, oh Clinton, for you and me. Oh boy, I don't think, eat your heart out, Frank Sinatra or anybody else. Nobody could have done it that well. You must be so happy to have a pro like me sing that song. And I also want to say I'm so excited about this, I may try to tweet this or Twitter this or whatever you call it. I want the world to know the magnificence and the power of the DeWitt Clinton marching song. Excelsior!
In his youth, Lee enjoyed writing and entertained dreams of one day writing the great American novel. He said that in his youth, he worked such part-time jobs as writing obituaries for news service wires and press releases for the National Tuberculosis Center, delivering sandwiches for the Jack May Pharmacy to offices in Rockefeller Center, working as an office boy for a trouser manufacturer, ushering at the Rivoli Theater on Broadway, and selling subscriptions to the New York Herald Tribune newspaper. He graduated from high school early, aged 16 and a half in 1939, then joined the WPA Federal Theater Project. With the help of his uncle Robbie Solomon, Lee became an assistant in 1939 at the New Timely Comics division of pulp magazine and comic book publisher Martin Goodman's company. Timely, by the 1960s, would evolve into Marvel Comics. Lee, whose cousin Jean was Goodman's wife, was formally hired by Timely editor Joe Simon. His duties were prosaic at first, but marshaling his childhood ambition to be a writer, young Stanley Lieber made his comic book debut with the text filler Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge in Captain America Comics number 3, 1941. He used the pseudonym Stan Lee, which years later he would adopt that as his legal name. He graduated from writing filler to actual comics with a backup feature, Headline Hunter, Foreign Correspondent, 2 issues later. Lee's first superhero co-creation was the Destroyer in Mystic Comics #6. Other characters he co-created during this period, fans and historians call the golden age of comic books, include Jack Frost, debuting in USA Comics #1, and Father Time, debuting in Captain America Comics #6. When Simon and his creative partner Jack Kirby left late in 1941, following a dispute with Goodman, the 30-year-old publisher installed Lee, just under 19 years old, as interim editor. The youngster showed a knack for the business that led him to remain as the comic book division's editor-in-chief as well as art director for much of that time, until 1972 when he would succeed Goodman as publisher. Stan Lee entered the United States Army in early 1942 and served within the U.S. as a member of the Signal Corps, repairing telegraph poles and other communications equipment. He was later transferred to the Training Film Division, where he worked writing manuals, training films, slogans, and occasionally cartooning. His military classification, he says, was playwright, and he adds that only 9 men in the U.S. Army were given that title.
And my job was to climb telegraph these poles that they had and establish the electric wiring so that the troops who followed me could communicate with each other. So I was to go ahead of the infantry. Anyway, that was my job. I was all set to be shipped. I was waiting on the dock for the ship. A guy pokes me on the shoulder and says, "Didn't you used to write comics?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, we're transferring you to the Army Film School. They have a training film area where they did training films for the troops, and you wrote books for the troops." What happened was it was taking too long to teach the troops how to use some of the complicated weapons or how to do all the things they had to do, like how to operate a tank and so forth. And they wanted the booklets and the training films made simpler. So they went to the simplest guy they could find. And it was my job to take all these complicated manuals and rewrite them. And I even did little cartoons. And I'll tell you something that's totally unglamorous. One of the problems they had, the payroll officers were taking too long to work out the payrolls for the troops. So there'd be some guy in Europe getting his butt shot off in combat, and he wasn't getting paid in time, and it was lousy for morale. So my job was to teach the payroll officers how to do their job faster and do their payrolls. I know about as much about payrolls as I do about atomic energy. But that was my job. So I made up a character called Fiscal Freddy, and I made up a game that you played on one page, and you had to get Freddy from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. But in order to do that, he had to answer trick questions. So I made a game out of it, and they all were doing the Fiscal Freddy game, and they were able to teach the payroll officers much faster than before. So the troops started getting paid, and this is why you come to these conventions. You learn things you never knew before. I single-handedly helped to win the war.
Vincent Fago, editor of Timely's animation comics section, which put out humor and funny animals comics, filled in until Lee returned from his World War II military service in 1945. Lee was inducted into the Signal Corps Regimental Association and was given honorary membership of the 2nd Battalion of 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment out of Joint Base Lewis McChord at the 2017 Emerald City Comic-Con for his prior service. In the mid-1950s, by which time the company was now generally known as Atlas Comics, Lee wrote stories in a variety of genres, including romance, westerns, humor, science fiction, medieval adventure horror, and suspense. In the 1950s, Lee teamed up with his comic book colleague Dan DiCarlo to produce the syndicated newspaper strip My Friend Irma, based on the radio comedy starring Marie Wilson. By the end of the decade, Lee had become dissatisfied with his career and considered quitting the field. In the late 1950s, DC Comics editor Julius Schwartz revived the superhero archetype and experienced a significant success with its updated version of The Flash, and later with Super Team, the Justice League of America. In response, publisher Martin Goodman assigned Lee to come up with a new superhero team. Lee's wife suggested that he experiment with stories he preferred, since he was planning on changing careers and had nothing to lose. Lee acted on that advice, giving his superheroes a flawed humanity, a change from the ideal archetypes that were typically written for preteens. Before this, most superheroes were idealistically perfect people with no serious lasting problems. Lee introduced complex, naturalistic characters who could have bad tempers, fits of melancholy, and vanity. They bickered among themselves, worried about paying their bills and impressing girlfriends, got bored, or were even sometimes physically ill. The first superheroes Lee and artist Jack Kirby created together were the Fantastic Four, based on a previous Kirby superhero team, Challenges of the Unknown, published by DC Comics. The team's immediate popularity led Lee and Marvel illustrators to produce a cavalcade of new titles. Working with Kirby, Lee co-created the Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, and the X-Men, with Bill Everett, Daredevil, and with Steve Ditko, Doctor Strange, and Marvel's most successful character, Spider-Man, all of whom lived in a thoroughly shared universe. Lee and Kirby gathered several of their newly created characters together into the team titled the Avengers, and would revive characters from the 1940s, such as the Submariner and Captain America. Comics historian Peter Sanderson wrote that in the 1960s, DC was the equivalent of the big Hollywood studios, after the brilliance of DC's reinvention of the superhero. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, it had run into a creative drought by the decade's end. There was a new audience for comics now, and it wasn't just the little kids that traditionally had read the books. The Marvel of the 1960s was in its own way the counterpart of the French New Wave. Marvel was pioneering new methods of comic storytelling and characterization, addressing more serious themes, and in the process keeping and attracting readers in their teens and beyond. Moreover, among this new generation of readers were people who wanted to write or draw comics themselves within the new style that Marvel had pioneered, and push their creative envelope still further. Lee's revolution extended beyond the characters and storylines to the way in which comic books engaged the readership and built a sense of community between fans and creators. He introduced the practice of regularly including a credit panel on the splash page of each story, naming not just the writer and penciler, but also the inker and letterer. Regular news about Marvel staff members and upcoming storylines was presented on the Bullpen Bulletins page, which, like the letters columns that appeared in each title, was written in a friendly, chatty style. Lee remarked that his goal was for fans to think of the comics creators as friends, and considered it a mark of his success on this front that, at a time when letters to other comics publishers were typically addressed Dear Editor, letters to Marvel addressed the creators by first name, Dear Stan and Jack, and so forth. Throughout the 1960s, Lee scripted, art directed, and edited most of Marvel's series, moderated the letters page, wrote a monthly column called Stan's Soapbox, and wrote endless promotional copy, often signing off with the traditional trademark Excelsior, which is also the New York State motto. To maintain his workload and meet deadlines, he used a system that was used previously by various comic book studios. Due to Lee's success with it, it became known as the Marvel Method. Typically, Lee would brainstorm a story with the artist and then prepare a brief synopsis rather than a full script. Based on the synopsis, the artist would fill the allotted number of pages by determining and drawing the panel-to-panel storytelling. After the artist turned and penciled pages, Lee would write the word balloons and captions, and then oversee the lettering and coloring. In effect, the artists were co-plotters, whose collaborative first drafts Lee built upon. Lee recorded messages to the newly formed Merry Marvel Marching Society fan club in 1965. Following Steve Ditko's departure from Marvel in 1966, John Romita Sr. became Lee's collaborator on The Amazing Spider-Man. Within a year, it overtook Fantastic Four to become the company's top seller. Lee and Romita's stories focused as much on the social and college lives of the characters as they did on Spider-Man's adventures. The stories became more topical, addressing issues such as the Vietnam War, political elections, and student activism. Robbie Robertson, introduced in The Amazing Spider-Man number 51, August of 1967, was one of the first African-American characters in comics to play a serious supporting role. In the Fantastic Four series, the lengthy run by Lee and Kirby produced many acclaimed storylines as well as characters that have become central to Marvel, including the Inhumans and the Black Panther, an African king who would be mainstream comics' first successful black superhero. The story frequently cited as Lee and Kirby's finest achievement is the three-part Galactus trilogy that began in Fantastic Four number 48. March of 1966, chronicling the arrival of Galactus, a cosmic giant who wanted to devour the planet, and his herald, the Silver Surfer. Fantastic Four number 48 was chosen as number 24 in the 100 Greatest Marvels of All Time poll of Marvel readers in 2001. Editor Robert Greenberger wrote in his introduction to the story that, as the fourth year of the Fantastic Four came to a close, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby seemed to be only warming up. In retrospect, it was perhaps the most fertile period of any monthly title during the Marvel Age. Comics historian Les Daniels noted that the mystical and metaphysical elements that took over the saga were perfectly suited to the tastes of young readers in the 1960s. And Lee soon discovered that his story was a favorite on college campuses. Lee and artist John Buscema launched the Silver Surfer series in August of 1968. The following year, Lee and Gene Colan created the Falcon, another African-American superhero, in Captain America number 117, September of 1969. Then in 1971, Lee indirectly helped reform the Comics Code. The U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare had asked Lee to write a comic book story about the dangers of drugs, and Lee conceived a 3-issue subplot in The Amazing Spider-Man number 96 through 98 from 1971, in which Peter Parker's best friend becomes addicted to prescription drugs. The Comics Code Authority refused to grant its seal because the stories depicted drug use. The anti-drug context was considered irrelevant. With Goodman's cooperation and confident that the original government request would give him credibility, Lee had the story published without the seal. The comics sold well, and Marvel won praise for its socially conscious efforts. The CCA subsequently loosened the code to permit negative depictions of drugs, among other new freedoms. Lee also supported using comic books to provide some measure of social commentary about the real world, often dealing with racism and bigotry. Stan's soapbox, besides promoting an upcoming comic book project, also addressed issues of discrimination, intolerance, or prejudice. In 1972, Lee stopped writing monthly comic books to assume the role of publisher. His final issue of The Amazing Spider-Man was number 110, and his last Fantastic Four was number 125. Looking at Stan Lee's later career, in 1975 he became a figurehead and public face for Marvel Comics. He made appearances at comic book conventions around America, lecturing at colleges and participating in panel discussions. Lee and John Romita Sr. launched the Spider-Man newspaper comic strip on January 3, 1977. Lee's final collaboration with Jack Kirby was The Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience, and published in 1978 as part of the Marvel Fireside book series, and it's considered to be Marvel's first graphic novel. Lee and John Buscema produced the first issue of The Savage She-Hulk, February of 1980, which introduced the female cousin of the Hulk and crafted a Silver Surfer story for Epic Illustrated number 1. Then he moved to California in 1981 to develop Marvel's TV and movie properties. He was an executive producer for, and made cameo appearances in, Marvel film adaptations and other movies. He occasionally returned to comic book writing with various Silver Surfer projects, including a 1982 one-shot drawn by John Byrne, the Judgment Day graphic novel illustrated by John Buscema, the Parable limited series drawn by French artist Mobius, and the Enslavers graphic novel with Keith Pollard. Lee was briefly president of the entire company, but soon stepped down to become publisher instead, finding that being president was too much about numbers and finance and not enough about the creative process that he enjoyed. Peter, Paul, and Lee began a new internet-based superhero creation, production, and marketing studio, Stan Lee Media, in 1998. But by the end of the year 2000, investigators discovered illegal stock manipulation by Paul and corporate officer Stephen Gordon. In 2001, Lee, Gil Champion, and Arthur Lieberman formed POW, Purveyors of Wonder Entertainment, to develop film, television, and video game properties. Lee created the risque animated superhero series Stripperella for Spike TV. In 2004, POW Entertainment went public. Also that year, Lee announced a superhero program that would feature Ringo Starr, the former Beatle, as the lead character. Additionally, in August of that year, Lee announced the launch of Stan Lee's Sunday Comics, a short-lived subscription service hosted by comicworks.com from July 2006 until September 2007. Lee hosted, co-created, executive produced, and judged the reality television show competition Who Wants to Be a Superhero on Sci-Fi. Brighton Partners and Rainmaker Animation announced their partnership to POW to produce a CGI film series, Legion of Five, Other projects by Lee announced in the late 2000s included a lineup of superhero comics for Virgin Comics, a TV adaptation of the novel Hero, a partnership with Guardian Media Entertainment and the Guardian Project to create NHL superhero mascots, and work with the Eagle Initiative program to find new talent in the comic book field. At the 2012 San Diego Comic-Con International, Lee announced his YouTube channel, Stan Lee's World of Heroes, which airs programs created by Lee, Mark Hamill, Peter David, Adrian Curry, and Bonnie Burton, among others. Lee wrote the book Zodiac, released in 2015 with Stuart Moore. The film Stan Lee's Annihilator, based on Chinese prisoner-turned-superhero named Ming, and in production since 2013, was released in 2015. In his later career, Lee's contributions continued to expand outside his style that he helped pioneer. An example of this is his first work for DC Comics in the 2000s, launching the Just Imagine series, in which Lee reimagined the DC superheroes Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, and The Flash. This period also saw a number of collaborators honor Lee for his influence on the comics industry. In 2006, Marvel commemorated Lee's 65 years with the company by publishing a series of one-shot comics starring Lee himself meeting and interacting with many of his co-creations, including Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, The Thing, Silver Surfer, and Doctor Doom. At the 2007 Comic-Con International, Marvel Legends introduced a Stan Lee action figure. At the 2016 Comic-Con International, Lee introduced his digital graphic novel, Stan Lee's God Woke, with text originally written as a poem he presented at Carnegie Hall in 1972. The print book version won the 2017 Independent Publisher Book Awards, Outstanding Books of the Year Independent Voice Award. Lee and his collaborator Jack Kirby appear as themselves in the Fantastic Four #10, the first of several appearances within the fictional Marvel Universe. The two are depicted as similar to their real-world counterparts, creating comic books based on the real adventures of the Fantastic Four. Lee was parodied by Kirby in comics published by rival DC Comics as Funky Flashman. Kirby later portrayed himself, Lee, production executive Saul Brodsky, and Lee's secretary Flo Steinberg as superheroes in What If #11. What if the Marvel Bullpen had become the Fantastic Four, in which Lee played the part of Mr. Fantastic. Lee also made numerous cameo appearances in many Marvel titles, appearing in audiences and crowds at many character ceremonies and parties, and hosting an old soldiers reunion in Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos #100. Lee appeared unnamed as the priest at Luke Cage and Jessica Jones' wedding in New Avengers Annual #1. He pays his respects to Karen Page at her funeral in Daredevil Volume 2 #8, and appears in The Amazing Spider-Man #169. In 1994, artist Alex Ross rendered Lee as a bar patron on page 44 of Marvel's #3. From 1945 to 1947, Lee lived in the rented top floor of a brownstone in the East 90s in Manhattan. He married Joan Clayton Bucock on December 5, 1947, and in 1949 the couple bought a house in Woodmere, New York on Long Island, living there through 1952. Their daughter, Joan Celia J.C. Lee, was born in 1950. Another child, daughter Jan Lee, died 3 days after delivery, tragically, in 1953. The Lees resided in Long Island town of Hewlett Harbor, New York from 1952 to 1980. In September 2012, Lee underwent an operation to insert a pacemaker, which required canceling planned appearances at conventions. On July 6, 2017, his wife of 69 years, Joan, tragically died of complications from a stroke. She was 95 years old. In April 2018, The Hollywood Reporter published a report that claimed Lee was a victim of elder abuse. The report asserted that, among others, Kia Morgan, business manager of Lee and a memorabilia collector, had been isolating Lee from his trusted friends and associates following his wife's death as to get access to Lee's wealth, estimated to be worth about $50 million. Ultimately, in August 2018, Morgan was issued a restraining order to stay away from Lee, his daughter, or his associates for 3 years. And that was our look at the greatest comic book contributor the world has ever seen, the late and great Stan the Man Lee. We hope you liked our show. Next week, I'm going to do a show based on a character that I loved growing up called E-Man, which was published by Charlton Comics. That was going to be the show I was going to do this week, but Mr. Lee's untimely death brought me to the point where I needed to produce this show first. And tragically, as I said, Stan Lee lived a long, eventful life, Most people who make it to 95 aren't very active, and Lee was active, doing everything from conventions, cameos in movies, anything he could to promote his characters. This was my tribute to one of the greatest comic book personalities of all time, the late and great Stan Lee. Until next time, this is Kevin Given saying so long, and keep reading those comics.